Are you tired of the same old DIY projects and are looking for fresh inspiration and some ideas that you haven't seen before? Well, in today's video, I'll be upcycling and repurposing 10 easy to find thrift store items in a variety of unconventional and original ways. So if you're ready for some different DIYs, let's get started. I recently saw this rabbit totem pole on the Mackenzie Childs website for $795. It's quite large, 53 inches tall, but still, I find that price outrageous. So I decided to see if I could make one just using odds and ends that I already had in my stash. I created the base using 3 boxes turned upside down. The largest one was an old photo organizer whose lid was originally hinged on. I added an extra piece of plywood to fill in and reinforce its bottom. Then I used Gorilla Glue to attach all 3 boxes together. I then attached an old table spindle to the top box to give the tower a little more height. And finally, I attached a ceramic rabbit to the top of the spindle. I let the Gorilla Glue dry overnight. The next day, I sprayed the entire piece with a coat of Zinsser primer. Once the primer was dry, I ran a bead of caulk in the seams between each of the boxes, the spindle, and the rabbit. This would give it a unified appearance and add to its durability. To add some decorative interest, I drilled a small hole in the corner of one of the boxes, added Gorilla Glue, and inserted a piece of thrift store metal wall art into the hole. I arranged the metal branches to help hold it in place. Since the Mackenzie Childs rabbit totem pole was green, I decided that I would spray paint mine with a couple coats of leafy green spray paint. I thought the bottom 2 boxes were looking a little plain, so I used some super glue to attach some Dollar Tree wood cutouts. Then I painted the cutouts with the same green spray paint. Some people don't realize that you can use wax over spray paint. I just let the spray paint dry for about 24 hours before applying the wax. To imitate the Mackenzie Childs totem pole, I should have used antiquing wax, but I chose to use white wax instead because I just really love the look of white wax on green paint. If you saw last week's video, then you know that I regret that I came home without buying either one of these unique clocks. So this week, I'm going to see if I can make a larger wall or floor clock using things from my stash. For the clock portion, I found this thrift store clock that had 3 little feet that were screwed and glued on, so it took a little effort to get them off. Once they were removed, I ran my orbital sander along the bottom of the clock to make sure that it was completely smooth. For the body of the clock, I found this thrift store wood shelf that I think someone had made and used as a horizontal shelf. But I was going to use it vertically, and so I sanded what would be the top to create a good, clean, even surface. Then I used wood glue to attach the clock to the top of the wood shelf. It takes a while for wood glue to dry, so I used a little painter's tape to keep the clock in place. Once the wood glue was dry, I removed the back of the clock, and then I removed all the inner parts, including the clock face and glass. I put the screws and all the parts in a container so that I wouldn't lose anything. Then I painted the shelf and clock with 2 coats of a dark green acrylic enamel paint. This was a mist tint that I got at the hardware store for just $2. While the paint was drying, I carefully removed the hands of the clock, keeping all of the pieces in order so that I would remember how to reassemble it later. Then I covered the clock face with a small piece of peel and stick wallpaper that I had left over from a different project. I used an X-Acto knife to trim the edges of the wallpaper and cut out the hole in the center. And then I reassembled the clock hands. Here's a diagram showing the order of assembly for a typical battery-operated clock. Then I put all the parts back into the body of the clock. First the glass, then the separator that creates room for the clock hands to move, the clock face, and finally, the clock back. I also added a small bird cutout from Dollar Tree to add a little detail to the front of the clock. And to hang it on the wall, I added 2 D-rings on the back of the wood shelf in locations where they wouldn't be noticeable. Some of you know that I was a high school English teacher for many years before I started my YouTube channel. And although I love working from home, one of the major drawbacks is that I move around a lot less and I snack a whole lot more. So I was super excited when Hume Health reached out to me and asked me to try the Dara Smart Scale. This is not your typical scale. This is a comprehensive health tool. Sure, it shows your weight, but it also provides 16 other health metrics, including bone mass, metabolic age, and BMR. Unfortunately, I've discovered that I'm not nearly as healthy as I thought I was. But the scale has honestly motivated me, not just to lose a few pounds, but to improve my overall health. So if you could use a little help in reaching your weight and health goals, you're in luck because the Dara Smart Scale is currently 30% off on their website. Plus, if you click on the link in my description box and use the code Canterbury, you'll get an additional 20% off. That's half price, and that's a good deal. I think this next project is my favorite this week because it wasn't planned. I just wanted to come up with an idea to use those strange little feet that I knocked off the bottom of the clock. There were only 3 of them, so I used Gorilla Glue to attach them to a wood spool that came with some ribbon that I purchased at Christmas time. I painted the spool and the feet with some black latex paint that I had on hand, and when the paint was dry, I lightly distressed the spool and the feet. Then I added a little bit of styrofoam and hot glue in the center hole of the spool to hold a couple faux floral stems. After adding the flowers, I added a few additional leaves and some moss around the base of the stem. To add some interest to the wooden spool, I applied a small portion of a white transfer from the IOD Traditional Pots package. I couldn't get the P in Paris to stick for some reason, so I applied a little Mod Podge to that area and waited for it to dry. And then I tried again, and this time it stuck. I found a glass cloche in my stash that fit the spool perfectly. The only problem was that the bottom edge of the glass was sharp. You can see from the Band-Aid on my hand that I got cut cleaning the glass. So to make sure that it was safe, I hot glued a piece of black ribbon around the bottom, extending just a bit beyond the edge. I had an idea for dressing up this small lamp that I had previously painted with ivory chalk paint. I found this metal wall art at Goodwill for a couple dollars. The flowers were held in place by nuts on the back of the frame, so I removed the nuts and then used pliers to pop off the small screw extensions on the flowers. Next, I drilled a small hole in one of the corners of the lamp base and added Gorilla Glue in the hole and on the metal stem. Then I inserted the stem into the hole and tied the flowers to the lamp with some twine to hold them in place until the Gorilla Glue had dried. I had originally planned to paint the flowers ivory to match the lamp, but once they were attached, I really liked the colorful look and decided to leave them just as they were. I had previously glued some trim to the bottom of the lampshade and decided to add some additional red rickrack to coordinate with the flowers. I opted to use fabric glue instead of hot glue for a flatter, cleaner look. As I finished up with the lamp, I began wondering what I could do with the picture frame that once held the metal flowers. Because it had a linen fabric interior, I decided to turn it into a small tray. Unfortunately, there were 2 holes where the screws had been, so I used some fabric glue and some burlap trim from Dollar Tree to create a stripe down the middle that would conceal both holes. As you can see, I decided to create sides for the tray using old wooden spools. I tried to use ones that were the same height, but there was a little bit of variance. If a spool still had the paper labels, I sanded the bottom one off so that the hot glue would adhere better. I like that some of the spools still have thread on them, but let me know, do you think I should have removed it? I laid out the spools to check the spacing and arrangement, and then I just worked my way around the picture frame, hot gluing the spools in place. Once the spools were glued to the frame, I decided to add a square dowel rod across the top of the spools to give the tray a more finished look. I marked the length needed on each dowel rod and then cut them using my miter shears. Because I had left the paper labels on the tops of some of the spools, I attached the dowel rods with Gorilla Glue instead of hot glue. I let the glue dry overnight, and the next day I sanded out the corner joints. I also grabbed some wood handles that I had removed from something or other in the past. I sanded the wood on the back of the handle and on the side of the picture frame, and then glued the handles on with Gorilla Glue. I kind of wish I had stained the dowel rods before attaching them, because once they were attached, the stain would have bled into the spools. Even so, I think it turned out super cute. I had this frame left over from a project in last week's video. When I took it apart, I was surprised to see that the mat was actually painted onto the glass. A while back, a sweet viewer sent me several pages from a vintage bird book, and I wanted to use one of those bird images in this frame. The image was too small for the mat opening, so I tore the edges around the bird image and then glued it to the center of another page from the same book. The reason I didn't use this frame in last week's project was because of its small size. and it's still small, so I'm going to make it bigger. I took this larger thrift store frame, popped off the back easel, removed the glass, and used paper tape to tape the back closed. Next, I applied Gorilla Glue to the back side of my small frame and then centered it on the front of the larger frame. I weighted it down with a few books to hold it in place and let the glue dry overnight. The next day, I applied a thin bead of caulk in the seam between the two frames to unify the frames and to provide extra durability. When the caulk was dry, I painted the large frame with dark brown chalk paint to help disguise the chips and damage to the frame. I painted the inner portion with light brown chalk paint to disguise the caulk line. Once the paint was dry, I lightly distressed the large frame with sandpaper and sealed it with antiquing wax, wiping away most of it. I don't think anyone would guess that this frame wasn't made to look this way. For this next project, I started with a thrift store towel rack that someone had painted red. To cover that red paint, I sprayed it with a coat of gray Zinsser primer. Once the primer was dry, I mixed up some salt wash with white chalk paint and brushed it over the towel rack. Salt wash creates a textured, crusty, aged appearance that I love. When the salt wash and paint mixture was dry, I lightly distressed the rack with sandpaper and then sealed it with clear wax. To create a propagation station, I found 4 small glass jars in my stash, and to make those jars pretty, I added a small IOD botanical rub-on transfer to each bottle. Next, I cut a short strip of heavy florist wire to fit around the top of each bottle. I twisted a small loop in the wire, wrapped it around the bottle neck, and then twisted a second loop in the wire on the side opposite the first loop. Then I twisted the ends of the wire together tightly around the bottle neck. I used wire snips to cut away any extra wire. To hang the bottles from the towel rack, I ran some twine through the wire loops and tied the twine to the top rack. I recently thrifted this old tin tile and wanted to do something different with it. But since it was real tin, I didn't want to deface it by putting any holes in it. So I decided to apply an IOD landscape paint inlay. I knew that the textured surface of the tin would result in a less than perfect transfer, but I thought that would be appropriate for this vintage piece. First, I planned the layout and then trimmed off the edges of each of the individual transfers. Then I painted the tile with white chalk paint and let the paint dry. Then I came back and applied a second coat of chalk paint in an area the size of one of the transfers. I carefully placed the transfer into the freshly painted area and spritzed it with water, and carefully pressed the transfer into the paint. I repeated this process until the entire tile was covered. I let it dry for a couple of hours, then I spritzed it with water again, waited about 30 seconds, and then began carefully peeling off the inlays. I was really pleased with how the large tree on the left side of the tile turned out, but I was disappointed with the right side, especially the bull. I think because I pressed the paint inlays into the paint using my hands on the left side of the tile instead of using a cloth helped the inlays to form to the tile's design. I knew it was risky, but I decided to reapply the transfer to the lower right-hand side of the tile, which included the images of the bull and a boat. So I repeated the steps, and when I peeled off the transfer for the second time, the boat was much better, but the bull was only slightly better. So on to plan C. I mixed some white and black paint together to try to match the gray paint color of the inlays. Then, using the tiniest paintbrush, I dotted on the gray paint to fill in some of the missing areas, using the cover picture as a guide. I'm no artist, but I think it turned out really well. It definitely has that aged appearance of having been painted a long time ago. This thrift store mirror originally came from Hobby Lobby, and there was no hanging hardware on the back, so I think it must be a vanity tray. It has a really pretty frame, but it's missing some of its reflective backing. So I decided to paint over both the frame and the mirror with 2 coats of an acrylic enamel paint. Once the second coat of paint was dry, I applied an IOD rose transfer in the center of the mirror, and I added some typography along the top. This is a great way to use some of the transfers that you might have left over from previous projects. I flipped the mirror over and used some Gorilla Super Glue to attach a D-ring to the back so that this could be hung from the wall. For this next project, I started with this thrift store metal stand that probably originally came with a bowl full of decorative rocks. Instead of replacing the bowl, I decided to use a Dollar Tree snow globe instead. To create terrarium decor to put inside the globe, I started by using a moss-covered styrofoam rock. I made small holes in the styrofoam, added hot glue in the holes, and then inserted various faux greenery stems. The mushroom is actually a toadstool that I pulled up from my yard and dried out in my garage. I glued some additional moss to the styrofoam rock to create a larger base that would completely cover the inside of the snow globe lid. After I pushed it inside the globe, I covered the bottom with hot glue and then pushed the plastic stopper into the glue. This would keep it upright and keep it from moving around inside the globe. I didn't really need the lid, so I decided not to reattach it. Instead, I just covered the threads on the globe by gluing on some burlap ribbon around the base. Thank you so much for watching today, and if you enjoyed these different DIYs, here's another video I think you may like.